have the honorable, right, the distinguished former mayor of the Fairbanks North Star Borough, which for those of you who are newer to the Arctic or to Alaska, our borough is about the size of New Jersey. Taryn was talking about New Jersey last week. And so while we have maybe only about 90 to 100,000 people, we have this enormous landscape. And I'm very excited to listen to how that poses obviously super different challenges than perhaps being the mayor of Fairbanks, also an honorable profession, but right, with a much smaller population and geographic footprint. So Bryce J. Ward was born and raised in Alaska's interior and has been a lifelong resident of the Fairbanks North Pole area. He was elected as the 12th mayor. Can you imagine that, how young we are as a state? The 12th mayor of the Fairbanks North Star Borough. And again, if you're getting used to being here, FNSB is Fairbanks North Star Borough. In 2018, he was elected and he served a 3-year term as the chief administrative officer of the borough. Prior to his tenure as borough mayor, Ward served as the mayor of the city of North Pole, Alaska. So you can ask as well, right, about these differences in terms of geography and numbers of people. And then the famous rivalry between Fairbanks and North Pole. His leadership and contributions to the community were recognized, this is big, right, in 2021 when he was named one of Alaska's top 40 under 40 young professionals. And this came from the Alaska Journal, the Alaska Chamber of Commerce. So please, without further ado, Mayor Ward, if you'd like to come up, and I will take a seat. And if any timing issues happen, I'll kind of signal you, but.
Wonderful. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight, and excuse me. I hope I have some good inspiring words to leave you with and some insights, and I really am looking forward to the Q&A section. That's one of my most favorite things about when I get to speak with folks is, you know, what questions do you have about whatever it is I might be talking about. So there's a few questions that I was asked to maybe go through, and I'm going to talk about those here in just a minute. One of them is, and folks have asked, is like, how did you get involved in politics? How did you get involved in leadership? And you know, for me, being involved in leadership roles was something that goes back to even when I was, I'd say back in elementary school. Now I'll say that even back then, or I would say back then, I wasn't terribly successful at it, but I had this desire to serve the public or to serve my community, my classmates, or whatever it was, whatever organization I was a part of. But I was not very successful. It wasn't until I got up into high school, middle school age, where I actually got into some leadership roles and was able to participate in those activities. And my mom would always tell me, remember Abraham Lincoln. He failed a lot before he was successful. And that was kind of one of these things that motivated me when I was younger to keep trying, even though you'd run for a seat and you wouldn't win. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have something to offer. When I did get, when I graduated from high school, graduated from the university, actually was involved in construction. I'm still involved in construction. And this is how I got involved into politics. I was listening to one of our local talk radio shows, and at the time, there was only one person that had filed for the North Pole City Council seat, and there was actually 2 seats that were open. And so they said, "Oh, it's, you know, we need someone to get involved, to go down and, you know, talk to the city clerk and get involved in the city council. You know, it's a shame that only one person is down there doing it." And so I went home, was newly married at the time, and was talking to my wife about the day. And I said, you know, I can't believe we just moved into the city too, North Pole. And I said, you know, no one even wants to run for city council, and, you know, there's an open seat, and no one even filed for it. And she said, and this to this day, she goes, I don't know what I was thinking at the time, but she said, how can you expect someone to do something that you're not willing to do? And so I said, well, I guess that means I should go down and talk to the city clerk then. And she said, maybe you should. And so I went down and talked to the city clerk and said, hey, you know, I heard that there only one person that filed for a council seat. And she said, oh, are you interested? And I said, well, maybe. And she said, yes, you're interested. Let me sign you up. And so, of course, you still have to go through an election, but it was post the filing time. And so what that meant is I had to do a write-in campaign to get elected onto the city council. And so I did. Made up a few signs, put them up around town, talked to my friends, you know, and got my name out a little bit. And guess what? I got elected to the city council my first time. with 36 votes. But it's North Pole, so, big elections, like 200 or 300 people. So the joke was, this is my dad's joke, because I had to beat Santa Claus. There was no Santa Claus at the time. There is now a resident named Santa Claus. But anyway, I beat Santa Claus, got elected to the city council, and served a year on the council. And when I was there, really took time to get involved with the departments, to learn the function of the city. And that was something that folks said, hey, you really pay attention, you dive into the details, you do your research, and you listen when people have something to say. And so a year later, the mayor was turned out. It was Mayor Doug Isaacson at the time. And they said, hey, we need someone to run for mayor. And I had a lot of folks that encouraged me. They said, hey, you should run for mayor. And I was a young contractor kid. I was like 25. And I said, well, sure, okay. How hard can that be, being mayor, right? And so I ran. It was actually a four-way race with some other very notable folks that have been on the city council for a long time in North Pole, and had lots of experience in business and politics. And I came out on top. And I won that race, got elected, served 2 terms in North Pole. And I think one of the things that was really, especially in that pivotal time in my life, that helped me is, and it was one of the jokes, take a step back, one of the jokes when I got into office is all my directors could have been my grandparents. So it was a bit of a struggle when I first got involved, being so young. And I had to build my reputation. I had to build that trust with my directors, because although they knew me as a city council member, they knew me as a resident, it was a different thing to know you as like the boss, right? And so that took time. That took energy for me to dive into the details, to learn what it was that they were doing, learn the functions. And for the first couple months, I didn't do a whole lot. I just listened, met with the directors. And that was one of the things that I think folks said that they were the most kind of impressed with, is I actually got out, visited the departments, remember our public works, utilities, went out and saw the sewer treatment plant, saw the wells and the water treatment plant, saw where they worked and where they did their things every day. And it helped give context, right? So when you're developing a budget, when you're looking at some sort of functional change in the operations, how it impacts your people. And that was something that was really meaningful to me. So I did 6 years as North Pole City Mayor from 2012 to 2018. And actually I was, at that time I was planning on going back to contracting, and I was like, I've done this mayor thing, I'm gonna sail on into the sunset, right? Something like that. And actually it was former Mayor Carl Castle at the Fairbanks North Star Borough, who I worked with, actually Mayor Hopkins as well, worked with him, Mayor Luke Hopkins. And they had said, hey, Carl had said, I really think you should run for the borough mayor seat. I think you have a lot to offer. You've been very engaged in the issues that not only impact North Pole, but impact the greater community. And he worked on me for about a year and said, really, I think this is something that you should do. And again, my wife, bless her heart, I love her to death, said, maybe you should listen to Carl. I think maybe he's got something for you to offer you, and you should hear what he has to say. And so we took time to think about it. For us and our family, we prayed about it and said, is this something that I should do? And put my name in and got elected to that seat, served 2 terms, 6 years, and just got done here this fall, passing off the reins to Mayor Hopkins at the borough. And so tremendous time, huge change, right? The city is one function. You were talking about that earlier. The cities being home rule cities, and then we got this thing called a borough that has second-class authorities. How those 2 overlay. It's really a fascinating and interesting thing when you look at like Alaska, how it was developed as a state. I think what our founding fathers, if you will, had really intended for us as a state, as a community, when we looked at these issues of how we deal with resource development, how we deal with our communities, how we deal with development growth, and then just being in a state that is so large. So that's really a fascinating thing to me, something that I've really dived into, both my time as mayor for the city and then at the borough, trying to understand, the structure that we're in, and how we can make it better, how we can understand why, the reasons why it was implemented the way that it was. So let's see here. Talking about leadership in the Arctic and Alaska, I talk about boroughs, right? Boroughs are this really unique thing. When you talk with some people, they're like, I don't understand what a borough does. Well, it's similar to a county, but it's not the same. I talked about cities. Our cities, most of them are home rule, at least the big ones like, Fairbanks, North Pole, Anchorage, etc. And the way I explain it to folks is a home rule is basically state law tells you what you cannot do. So state law would say something like, you cannot wear a red shirt. But that means you can wear any other color of the rainbow that you desire, any other mix, match, whatever you want to do, but you just can't wear a red shirt. A second-class borough or a general law community, you can only do what state law tells you to do, or what it gives you authority to do. So the example would be is if state law said you can only wear a red shirt, then you can only do that function. You can't do any other thing out there. And so when we look at how Alaska and our communities were developed, that's kind of the framework when we talk about home rule and general law and the differences between the two. There's some nuances, but they're pretty minor for all things considered. So like an example at the borough, one of the things I dealt with was education funding. And this was actually one of my biggest challenges. I was talking with one of your students about that here earlier. And continues to be a challenge, I think, on a statewide level. State law was very specific that home rule or that your general law communities, and the fundamental baseline of a community is education funding. It's actually 4 different things. You got to tax yourself, you got to provide for education, you have to provide for planning and platting. Those are 4 things that if you're going to be a community and you're going to be ordained by the state, then those are the 4 things that you have to do. And then it builds from there, right? So as a second-class borough, you can add functions, whether by election or by state law. And our community has done that. If you actually go through the budget book, or if you look into the borough code, you can find these different things that were added and how they were added. Some of them were added by ordinance. They were allowed to be the authority was brought on by ordinance. Some of them were by deferment. So the cities deferred an authority to the borough. Some of them were by general election. And so the community voted on something for us to take on. Example would be like animal control. Animal control was voted on by the community. Fairbanks, North Star Borough residents said, we want to manage this resource. We want to provide for public health and safety through animal control. Other ones like parks and recreation, that was taken on by ordinance, by election, excuse me, where actually the city of Fairbanks provided parks and rec powers. And then the borough said, we're going to do this on an area-wide basis across the entire community. And so there was actually a period where there was transition of resources and assets, insert Pioneer Park, Alaska land, where that was formerly run by the city, and then it was transferred to the borough. So lots of different nuances, but if you think about it like layers, and you think about it like another example is a la carte. As communities across the state of Alaska, we can choose these resources or these services that we want to provide. Every model can be different. Our community doesn't look like our neighbors down the road in, let's say, Delta or Healy or Matsu or Kenai. Every community has a different makeup, which is great because it gives you that flexibility to dive in and learn about, or not learn, but to have that. What's the word I'm looking for? To have that character of a community that you're looking for. So you can, if you want a community that does this, but they don't do that, you can do that in Alaska. The challenge is that not everyone understands that. And so it requires you and I as citizens of the state to really be engaged in how your state is structured, how your community is structured, and how the authorities are that you have or have come into place. And there may be really good stories about or examples as to why you don't have a certain power or authority and another community does. So, that's one thing that I think in my time as mayor, both for the city and the borough, I've tried to communicate to people is that Alaska is different. Our Arctic community is different because every community can choose a different thing that they want or don't want to do. If you want to have parks and recreation, you can. If you don't, then you don't. have to. There's nothing in state law that says that you have to do that under our current structure. So I mentioned one of my big challenges that I faced when I was in office, and I think that we continue to face as a state, is education funding. And it's been interesting since I've been out of office. I think lots of people have called and texted and emailed me about different things, but most of them, I'd say 90% of those communications have been in regards to education funding. When I was in office, one of the things that I really tried to dive into and spend quite a bit of resources on was understanding the state structure for education funding in and of itself. So I talked about one of the fundamental building blocks of a community is education. Goes right up there with platting and planning. And the structure that we have as a state, in my opinion, is broken. And it's something that I think requires legislative action to change. The funding mechanism of how resources are given to communities is a challenge, as well as how communities' contribution to education is structured. So one of the things I talked about I've talked about in former sessions, if you will, on education funding, is the two pieces. The big pieces are the state's funding, and then you've got a local contribution. What the state of Alaska says is that local communities that tax themselves shall tax themselves for education. And so what that means is, like for the Fairbanks North Star Borough, they have a requirement that 2.65 mils or an equivalency of property tax be contributed to education. What they don't tell you in the statute, it's in the statute, but what people don't necessarily get a hold of is what that means to the state funding. So just use some rough numbers for examples, but if the state contributes $100 million to local education in the Fairbanks North Star Borough, I think it's about that much. Then this required local contribution reduces how much the state pays into the education pot based on that 100 million. So it may be that the basic need is identified as $100 million, but the state only contributes 75 million because you and I as taxpayers contribute the other 25. The problem is, and this goes back to this fundamental basis of Alaska and how we were structured, is that not all of Alaska was incorporated into communities like boroughs at statehood or even post-statehood. There's actually a Mandatory Boroughs Act, I think of 1960 or 1962, somewhere in there, that required all communities to incorporate into boroughs. That was never fulfilled. So the way that they fulfilled it, if you talk to legislators, is they say, well, we have the unorganized borough, which is a borough, but it's not. So first, and one of the things I've talked about with this education funding piece is if it was a borough, then they would have to contribute to education just like you and I would here in the Fairbanks North Star Borough, or Nenana, or Anchorage, or Kenai, or Matsu Borough. So this continues to be something that I've been passionate about. I see as the future moves on, maybe an opportunity to continue to provide information. I really encourage people to dive into the funding stream and how this is structured, because I don't think it's fair. And one of the other interesting things I'll touch on with this particular issue is, as a community grows, your local contribution is based on your property values. So your local contribution also grows. However, the state's contribution to education has been relatively flat, if not declining. And so the state continues to pay less and less, and you and I continue to pay more and more, even though we may have less and less students in the district. So it's a system that does not, it does not promote, I think, what we want to see, which is growth and health in our education system. Instead, it punishes us, I would say, as a community for being incorporated, because an unincorporated community pays nothing into this scheme and actually is held harmless from these impacts as we talk about growth and property tax values, et cetera. So let's see here. Okay, I spent a lot of time talking about education funding. I'm passionate. If you ever want to know more about it, let me know. So one of the other questions that I wanted to dive into was asked, what is your leadership style? And so I've actually spent quite a bit of time looking at this as I've kind of grown and developed over the last few years. And I'd say one of the things how I would classify my leadership style is a servant leader. And so there's a lot of stuff out there about different leadership styles. Some folks really like servant leadership, some people really don't. I'm kind of a mixed bag. When I look at what I do and how I do things, you know, the thing that I align, I would say, with servant leadership the most is that I believe the position that I have as a leader is to serve the public in some capacity. It's not to serve my own interest or my own passions. And actually, in my former experience, most of the time it comes at my own detriment, which, you know, is not necessarily a good or healthy thing either. But when I look at how I've done, you know, the mayoring thing, whether it be at the city or the borough, you know, really focusing on this idea of servant leadership of the people that I serve, whether it be the community or whether it be employees or public officials, other public officials, you know, that's really something that's resonated with me. I tend to also want to be a problem solver. And so one of the things that I've struggled with as a leader is I love to dive into the details. I love to know more about the issues. And I love to offer solutions. However, as a leader, you oftentimes want your people to generate those solutions to the problems because there's ownership, because there's then you also know that your folks, that your team understand the issue. If they can take a problem, they can break it down into bite-sized pieces, and they can come up with solutions to those issues. And so as I've worked on this in my own life, it's been something that I've had to really focus on is, hey, when someone comes to you with a problem, hey, Mr. Mayor, you know, we've got this issue, this thing that just blew up. Is you say, okay, you take in the information and then you work with your team to say, hey, what do you guys think about this? What information do we need that we don't have available to us? How do we break this problem down? And that's been something that's been really helpful for me is engaging with your people, encouraging and empowering them to be able to ask questions and to really start to break down problems themselves. And, you know, of course, you want to have an idea of where you're going to go, but you want to encourage and empower your people to really come up with those solutions and help kind of guide those conversations based on the framework that you have, the principles that you have as a leader. That's been something that's been really successful for me. I love whiteboards, our chalkboards. If you go back then, yeah. So being able to whiteboard issues and then talk about it with your team and encourage and empower your team to take rabbit trails. Maybe they don't necessarily have, if you're looking at like a problem or an issue, sometimes you have to take these rabbit trails to kind of explore this idea to find out that it wasn't a good idea. And that's okay. You don't always have to have like this perfect solution. And, you know, as you talk about leadership in the Arctic, sometimes it's a little messy, right? Sometimes you break a few eggs, but that's a necessary process to go through. What I found is in order to come up with the solutions that you're really looking for as a community. Let's see. You know, another really important thing that I found in my time is you've got to build trust. You got to build trust with your team. You got to build trust with your community, those that you're serving, whether it be in an elected official capacity or whether it be in a corporate capacity or an educational setting. It's really important to make sure that you've got that trust level with your team. If you don't, then it's incredibly difficult to actually be able to give a task out and then know that your folks are going to get that thing done, whatever it is that you're working on. And so, you know, being able to be honest with your teammates, with your leadership team that you put together in whatever, you know, like I said, whatever capacity you're in, that's been something that's been very powerful for me as well. Some of the issues I talk about education funding, you know, one of the things that I've done, I mentioned I was a contractor. I've worked construction, and I'm doing that now. So I did get to ride off into the sunset after being the borough mayor, and I'm out at this point. My plan is to build houses. So housing continues to be an issue that we see across the nation, but it's a particular challenge here in the Arctic. And one of the things that I've become very passionate about is energy efficiency, how we can build efficient houses, and then also look at the cost factor. So how do you do it in a way that people can afford? I've got the energy efficiency thing down. We've got great resources with CCHRC and NREL here at the university. I absolutely love those folks. I basically learned everything I know from them. But the affordability piece is something that we got to work on. I'm still trying to nail that down, but that's my big thing that I'm working on right now. So finally, I was asked to give you some inspiring words as to what would I say to someone that's looking at getting engaged or getting involved in things on an Arctic level, from a leadership level here in the state. And, you know, there's a lot, I think one of the things that I find so unique about Alaska is we're such a big state, but we're really small when you look at the number of people that are here. And so it gives you a tremendous opportunity in Alaska to do things that you could never do anywhere else, whether it be engaging with like your senators, your local leaders, your local mayors, getting involved in boards or commissions, at the statewide level or at a local level. You have, just by sheer number, your odds are in your favor, or the odds are in your favor to get involved in some of those things, that whatever it is that you're passionate about. If it's, you know, for me, I love housing. If it's education, there are different ways and mechanisms that you can plug into different levels of authorities, if you will, here in the state. I would say, don't wait until you're ready. If you're passionate about it, get out there and do it. That was kind of how I got involved in things. I didn't think I was ready to be a mayor. I didn't think I was ready to be a council member, but I just kind of did it. And you know what? If you have a desire to learn and you have support from your family and your network that supports you, I would say go for it. Don't let your inhibitions be your blocking reason as to why you'd say, I don't feel comfortable enough getting in front of people. I don't feel comfortable enough putting my name out there. If you got that strong support, absolutely do it. Be ready to listen. I would say study on whatever it is that you're interested in. Do lots of reading, whether it be news articles or research articles or books. We are in an age where you can dive into the details on anything. If you want to look up what constitutional members of the state said and did, we have that at our fingertips. You can go pull it up on the library and you can read into what exactly they were saying and why they were saying the things that they did, to put in this goofy law that you don't understand what it means and why it's impacting you today. So absolutely, if you are interested in any of those type of areas, just do it. Just jump out there and do it, but be ready to put in the hard work, be ready to spend some time studying on it. And listen, one final story, and then I'd love to go to Q&A. When I first got elected in North Pole as the city mayor, I think I was like 3 weeks on the job, no clue what I was doing. I was figuring out as I go. And this gentleman came into the office and he goes, I need to speak to the mayor. And I just so happened to hear it. I was in my office. And so I came out. The ladies afterwards were like, but someone comes in and they say, you don't come out of your office. You wait, let us deal with it. So anyway, I never did that. But this gentleman came up and he goes, I need to speak to the mayor. And I came out and said, hey, what's going on? I'd never met him before and I've never seen him since. And he says, I need to talk with you. And so okay, sure, come on back. So come on back in the office and we sit down. And this guy chews my butt out for like 2 hours about everything that was wrong with the state, the country, everything that was wrong with everything. He just dumped it on me and I didn't know what to do. So all I did was just listen. I just sat there and, I took notes on what he was saying. And, there was stuff I was like, oh, should I argue? Or I just listened, wrote it all down. And afterwards he goes, I realized you can't do much about anything that I talked about, but thanks for listening. And he got up and left. And that has stuck with me my entire time, is involved in like a leadership capacity. Sometimes the most powerful thing that you can do is listen. And you don't always have to have the answers, but knowing that someone can come to you and say, here are my problems, and it gets filed in your file cabinet, however you do your stuff in your mind. Because someday something might come up and you go, oh, you know what? someone talk to me about that. But more importantly is that you listen and that person knows that, hey, if I've got an issue, I can come talk to you about it. And that's always left a meaningful impression. So anyway, I hope that was something that was worthwhile. And I'd be happy to do questions and answers. We could talk about anything, even stuff I didn't talk about, or if there was a nugget that you thought, geez, let's follow that rabbit trail. I love rabbit trails. So
because we have people on the, oh, yes, I'm sorry. Sarah, do you have a sense of how you want, or do we have Q&A figured out between online?
Yes,
Okay.
we are gonna walk around with the stick mics,
Okay.
and then if we get questions from Zoom, one of us will just run the mic up to Sarah and she'll.
Okay, question. Fantastic. Please, everything you ever wanted to know about speech.
I'm Mayor Ward. Thank you so much for the talk. That was really, thank you for sharing your stories and yeah, just like everything that you've experienced and learned through this process. I have a bunch of questions, but the first one that comes to mind is because the military is such a massive presence here and you've worked both at the city level and at the borough level, I'm really curious kind of what the relationships between local governments and like the commanders of these bases, or at what level do you interact with them, and like what kind of like jurisdictional challenges or yeah, anything related to like, I don't know, law enforcement or just, yeah, like community well-being, things like that. Just curious. Yeah, thanks.
yeah, that's a great question. As you know, military is a big part of our community. It's about 30%-ish of our local economy, either by the payroll that comes in for service members, or just the general churn and burn of the operations here between Fort Wainwright and Eielson. We actually have two other bases too that are directly impacting the Fairbanks area: Clear Air Force Base, and then you've got Fort Greeley down in the Delta area. You know, in my time in local elected capacities, right, as mayor, we've always had a really tight connection with military leadership, especially here at the local level. You know, I think relationship is the key piece to this. One thing that I learned in my time in office was that just like any relationship, it takes concerted effort from both parties to maintain. And we saw during like the COVID timeframe where we weren't as involved with each other's things because, you know, there was things that we couldn't do, right? Gatherings and whatnot for changes of command or for, you know, Christmas parties or whatever it may be. And I used to kind of think those were more gimmicky, like, oh, great, you know, mayors, you know, oh, they're all going to these parties all the time, right? But that's really important, especially as you talk about your relationship with the military, and the ability to communicate and talk about issues is key, is pivotal. Here locally, we have a couple things that we've done for a long time. I believe Mayor Hopkins is carrying these on as well. Was a civilian military meeting where leadership from the base would come together with leadership from the local community, and we would just have, you know, doors would be closed, and the things that we talked about stayed in that room. We talked about, you know, not talk about details, but if there was like an issue with a particular bar, right? The commander could say, or the, you know, mayor for the city could say, hey, look, we've got these issues going on. You know, it tends to be a lot of service members. And so we work with the commander, we talk about these things, and they maybe institute some changes at the local, on the installation level that impact those issues. Things like access to the installation. You know, it's a great resource. You've got, like with Birch Hill, you've got at Fort Wainwright, you've got access to skiing. They've got a great aquatic center now. A little jealous, just saying. But having those conversations with the commanders about how the community can build relationship, not just at the leadership level, but at a community level. Get out there and interact with service members, because that's what helps make their stay more memorable. As we know, many of them choose to stay here because of those relationships that are formed here at the local level. But that is, I would say, from a community perspective, you can't just ignore, you know, the 10 to 12,000 people that live at Eielson or at Fort Wainwright, or the 4,000 or 5,000 people that live at Eielson. They are a key piece to the community. And you've got to have that connection with your leaders here at the local level. So that does happen. I would say one of the things that we've seen that we've struggled with is as you go up the chain on the DoD side, it becomes more challenging. Our distance away from DC tends to be a bit of a problem with that. And we've had in my time in office, we had long conversations with folks from the Pentagon and from Department of Defense about how we can engage more with leaders that maybe sit down in Texas or maybe sit down in Washington, DC, and make decisions on bases that are in Alaska and personnel that are in Alaska and how that impacts the community. So making progress, but there's still work to be done.
Thank you very much.
Hey there, we have a few questions for you from online. I have 3, so bear with me for a second. First, we have Gretchen. She asked, when you first started presenting, you mentioned the idea of successful leadership a couple times. How do you define successful leadership, and has that changed over the course of your elected positions?
Ooh, that's a good one. So, when I first got involved in elected positions, when I talk about successful leadership, I thought it was getting things done, right? Achieving a task. And I think that is important. And I still think that you've got to get things done, right? You've got to focus on a task and get those things done. But as I've kind of grown in my own maturity, I think another key piece to that of successful leadership is empowering your people to be able to get these things done based on the principles and parameters that you have established as the leader. I said one of the things that I struggled with early on was, I'm a problem solver. And so I love to be able to dive into something, chew on the issue and then spit out an answer. And hey, this is what we're going to do. One of the things that I've learned is if you're the one as the leader that always comes up with the answers and always says, okay, here's what we're going to do about this particular problem, you then take away your ability of your leaders within your organization to do that same thing. And so what I found is that as you identify these issues, you need to be able to engage with the folks that you have on your team and help them be the problem solvers as well. You may already have sometimes you may sit down and you go, boom, 5 seconds. I know exactly the direction that we need to go. I know exactly how we need to fix this problem. And it depends on the situation, right? If it requires immediate attention, then as a leader, you jump in and say, hey, here's what we're going to do because it's a life and death situation or there's high stakes game that we're playing right now. But if you have the time, I would say always default to your team if you can to say, hey, guys, what are we going to do? Folks, what are we going to do about this problem? Here's the issue. What are we going to do? How are we going to tackle this problem? And that's been a lot more meaningful because you're focusing on your people and because leaders come and go, right? Organizations stay. And so if you can build up that strength within your team, in your organization, then when you're gone, those things can carry on and the strength that you've built in your team can continue on. So that's something that's taken me a little while to learn, but that's what I've from the beginning, it was very task oriented to the end. It's more people oriented.
Thank you. We have 2 more for you online before we come back to the room. Abby would like to know, you've mentioned the importance of building trust with your team. What sorts of behaviors or activities help build that trust?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things I think is being honest. And so being able to provide honest feedback. So if your team is doing great things, obviously say, hey, great job. But also if there's things that aren't going so well, is you can't sweep it under the rug. You can't ignore those type of things. You've got to sit down and say, look, hey, we've got an issue. I found that to be incredibly powerful when you can sit down with folks and say, look, here's the issue that we have. And this goes back to maybe some of the conversation we had on servant leadership. There's a really interesting podcast that I love to listen to. I don't necessarily agree with everything. It's called No Bullshit Leadership. And the guy's got an Australian accent. I love it to death. A little bit of difference in leadership style. So as part of this servant leadership philosophy that I have, to me, everyone's important. So every team member that you have has something to add, has some value to give. And so it's up to you as the leader to tap into that, to find out how to engage with that person, to get the most out of them in your team that you're working on. The no bullshit leadership guy, his kind of philosophy is more of a corporate philosophy, is like either put out or you get gone. I'm not sure if that's the right way of saying it or not, but we'll go with it. So you either produce or you're cut loose. That's a better way of saying it. All right, I like that. So I have not found that, and maybe it's, I dropped. All right, sorry for everyone online that just got mic bombed there. So I found that to be very much a part of my style, is to work with folks, and that can be really challenging. Sometimes you got a teammate that is a struggle, right? You're like, hey, look, we've talked about this, we've gone over different ways to try to address this issue. You know, it can be a real big challenge. Everybody's important, which I do believe that everyone has something to offer, but you've got to have engagement from that person as to be able to want to change the things that need to be adjusted, if you will, to get them back on target. Again, maybe my setting, you know, I don't necessarily come from a corporate world. I come from more of a public sector world. And so, you know, you can't necessarily just like cut people loose in the public sector like you would in the corporate sector. But I do think that, you know, that has definitely shaped my leadership style over time. So being able to be honest with folks, being able to communicate when you have struggles, I found that to be incredibly powerful too. You know, as a leader, people tend to think of you in some sort of pedestal, right? That you're always doing everything right, or you've always got everything figured out. The reality is there's many nights I would go home and I'd be like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't know how I'm going to fix this issue. I don't know what I'm going to do with this problem. And use judgment, but I think that can be an incredibly powerful tool when you come to your team and say, look, I'm at a roadblock. I need help because I don't have a solution to this problem. It's going to require more than just my mind. It's going to require a team effort here to come and solve this problem. So.
Thank you. I have one more question online and then we'll move back to the room. From Hannah, as someone who has worked in local government, sometimes priorities of yours as an individual can differ from the community. As a local leader, how do you determine which issues to prioritize when your personal goals versus the community when they don't align?
Ooh, this has been one that I think has been a struggle. When I think about kind of how I've shaped my political career, if you want to say that, one of the things that I've always struggled with is when an elected official comes in and says, I'm going to fix this, this, and this. I'm going to promise you this, this, and this. And they make all these promises that they can't keep. And so knowing that I don't know a lot has really encouraged me to say, okay, what do I know? And what I do know is that the way that I can interact with the community, the way that I can interact with the people that I serve in a leadership capacity, I can tell you how I'm going to do that. And so when I ran for office, what I said is, I'm going to serve with integrity, I'm going to serve with transparency and honesty. I can guarantee that those are things that I'm going to bring forward to the table. I'm not going to tell you that I'm never going to raise taxes. I'm not going to tell you that I'm never going to, you know, do this, whatever it is that people want you to do, right? PFD or whatever. I don't know what the thing is that everyone's talking about. There's lots you could fill in there. But I think from a leadership perspective and like from my own experience, you know, focus on the traits that you have to offer the problems are going to be dynamic, right? And we've seen that across the state. If you've been involved in local politics at a statewide level for any amount of time, I mean, we have gone from like, we've got tons of money to we have no money to, we can't even educate our kids to people are leaving. So you can go and say, I'm going to promise you this, this, and this. But at the end of the day, some of those things are just not within your control to do. So, what I found is if there are things that and obviously there's things that I would like to get done, that the community, may not be interested in. And that definitely is a struggle. I would say if you have a vision for something and the community is like, hey, we're not ready for that. I think maybe an example of one that, is an issue for the new mayor, is like this animal shelter issue. If you're tracking local politics here, I met with all of the staff at the borough at the animal control facility. I've gone through that facility. It needs to be replaced. It's like a $30 million building. That is huge. The practical thing that, the practical Bryce would say, you know what, we've saved the money, pay for it, do it. We've got staff that need it. We've got a service that we've been, the voters have brought in and said, we are going to do this. We are going to do animal control. We should do it. Community is not on board, right? There's a lot of turmoil about this. And I don't know what the answer is. I know if it was solely up to me, I'd say we've got the money, let's just do it. That's what we've saved it for. That's what it was intended for. But those values don't necessarily align with the community. And that's okay, right? So you dust off your bootstraps or I'm mixing analogies here, but sometimes you just got to let it go. You take it as far as you can, you make the case, and the community says, hey, we want to do something different. Actually, this happened with me back early on. Tell another little story. So we had the appeals process for quasi-judicial appeals at the borough. Actually, for all appeals at the borough is still very convoluted. So if you have like an animal control appeal or a plating appeal or a zoning appeal or any kind of appeal of a decision that was made by the borough, I think it was my second year in office, we came up with this idea of how to streamline this process. So whether it was quasi-judicial or whether it was a decision that was made by a staff member or was a decision made by a board, we came up with two processes, two tracks, regardless of what the issue was that you could follow. It would be really easy to identify how to come up with a solution and make it happen. Came up with actually we're talking about game boards here. Came up with this way of explaining this situation like a giant board game. It was the Board of Appeals. And so we had a Board of Appeals and you had a appeals officer that would inversely make a decision based on however it was a board or an appeals officer made the decision initially at the borough. I thought we came up with a great idea. We actually did some focus groups. We worked with folks to make sure we had communicated an effective message. And at the end of the day, the assembly and the community were like, no way, man. This is way too complicated. And then I was told it was way too simple, but people weren't ready for it. So at the end of the day, you know what? I put a lot of time and energy into this. I was really passionate about it. I understood it. But the community didn't want it and the assembly didn't want it. So at the end of the day, it gets filed in the cabinet and you move on, and that's okay. I learned a lot from it. So if you're interested in appeals processes in the borough, we have made some improvements over the years, but it's still not as comprehensive as I wanted. But anyway.
I can't resist.
Yeah.
Here's my.
We've got someone who's very familiar with the appeals process at the borough.
Thank you. Gary Newman here. I won't delve into that particular issue, but one of the things I've noticed of mayors, and you kind of alluded to this, you come up with all these ideas about how you're going to fix the borough, and then you spend a huge amount of time externally. You're going to different things, you're working with externally, and you basically have to delegate a lot of actually running the borough. I assume it goes through the chief of staff. And one of the challenges that I saw with the appeals process is that it fell basically to the legal department, which I've kind of feel like they kind of run the borough. And I think that's misplaced. They're supposed to be of counsel. So I know you struggled with this earlier on. I'm not sure how you've evolved with this, but maybe you can just talk about the roles that your people have internally that are meant to serve the public or, you know, the citizens through the various boards and commissions.
Yeah, so one of the things is as I talked about this a little bit earlier, you know, this idea of focusing on task and then kind of shifting to people is, you know, my time at the borough, I really try to dive into this idea of like, okay, if you want to have meaningful change in an organization, then it can't be task driven. It has to be people driven. You have to be able to empower people to be able to make decisions, to understand their authorities and their roles, and to clearly identify and define those things. And so you know, that was something I spent a lot of time on at the borough. Part of that was developing a new mission statement. And so that mission statement was 3 simple words: serve, lead, thrive. Really focusing on the first one is serve. The borough exists to serve the public. You know, there's a structure, there's a reason that state law has put this in place. And it's to make sure that, you know, staff and that the functions of the borough are here to serve the public in various capacities. And you think about, you know, it's animal control, right? Making sure that, you know, rabid animals aren't running around town. That's kind of the original reason why animal control was brought on, for public safety. But then also well-being of those critters. You also think of like plating, right? Plating is a public service. You need to make sure that you've got dedicated roads for people to get through your town. Otherwise, you can't get to the grocery store, you can't get to the post office, you can't get to your church, you can't get to your school. So everything that the borough does from that level is meant to serve in some capacity. And so helping encourage and empowering staff to understand that, I think is definitely, it's a struggle, but it's also really rewarding. One of the things I've found is that folks that get involved in public service as an employee generally do so because they have a desire to serve people in some capacity. So being able to give that structure, and I think empower is really the key word, right? Is you have to, in order for someone to be empowered in their job, they have to understand what their job is. They have to understand their authorities. And sometimes that can be really challenging, and it can take it can take time for folks to get in there. You'd mentioned, you know, the struggle that you have with maybe legal departments or folks that maybe give you guidance or direction. You know, when you talk about like a public capacity or public official, you know, there's a high level of scrutiny, right? That you have to follow your code, that you have to follow your processes, because 1, that's the law, but then 2, it's to ensure that you've got trust with the public and that you've got parity across issues. You don't want one administration to be making a decision based on how they feel and then another based on how they feel. That's what these codes and ordinances are in place to do, is make sure you've got effective ability to implement these things and then be able to have, you know, essentially the same rules that you're following for all different parties. So, you know, it's a challenge, right? When someone says, hey, you've got a process that you're not following. You know, it's a, you know, when you take public office, you stand up there and swear that you're going to follow the laws of the code and ordinances of the Fairbanks North Star Borough, of the state of Alaska, and the United States. And so I think oftentimes, you know, and folks like to hate on your legal and attorney teams, but their job is to tell you, hey, are you following the law or not? Your elected officials, your folks that are in your legislative capacities, it's their job to say, okay, maybe we don't like this law, or we don't like the, you know, how this is being interpreted by the judicial system. So it's our responsibility to make those changes. You know, I serve not in a legislative capacity, so that's one, I didn't talk about that earlier, but you know, the borough mayor serves as administrator, so kind of the executive. So you're not, borough mayor doesn't get to vote, which is great sometimes. But you know, you have to then implement some of those laws that maybe there aren't necessarily specific guidance on. And I can tell you what, it's a challenging thing to do, because you're expected to know your entire code as well as every other thing that impacts it out there in the world. So I know I surely didn't make it perfect. Good luck finding anyone who has, but being able to work with the community and work with work with your staff on those issues, I think is paramount. So.
Hi, my name is Emiko Newman, and I am a double major in Environmental and Energy Resource Engineering at CEM. So tonight we've talked a lot about local issues, and my minor, I would like to, when I start it, will be in environmental politics and policy. So I would like to ask you about, what percentage of you mentioned you're a servant leader, so you're serving the Fairbanks North Star Borough Municipality, if I'm using those terms correctly. Honestly, I don't know the difference between them. I just know my dad's on the borough board at home, and like he gets in his truck and he goes to people's houses, and they'll call him and they'll be like, Scott, I need you to run over, my car flipped, and he's like, I'm on my way. So he gets off his plane and he goes down because he's a Bushman pilot, and my mom has that same one actually. So that actually felt like home. Thanks for that. But anyway, so as a future engineer, I'm also interested in housing. I'm interested in energy resources and the most sustainable way Alaska can grow, while having like our subsistence hunting and fishing, and up here in the north, I'm from Southeast Alaska. There's these caribou or elk, these herds have been there for a real long time. Good stuff. So keeping their environment safe. So essentially, in your time that you were this mayor thing, you said that it's relatively easy with the odds to get involved with what you're passionate about, and while obviously you can't do everything. In your experience, what level or extent did you interact with maybe the United Nations, maybe the senators, and really what did the role that, if it did environmental politics and protections like conservation play in your responsibility as mayor?
Yeah, good question. I'd say maybe kind of I'll try to tackle that from a couple different angles. So locally, we have, I would say the state of Alaska really has a great communication with our congressional delegation. Here locally, I talked about the civilian military meeting that happens. There's also something called a Tiger Team, where we have leaders from across the community, as well as our congressional delegation calls in. Typically, it's staffers. It's military specific, that particular meeting, but it's a great way to have that one-to-one communication. When I was in office, we did it about once a month with the congressional delegation. You'd find out what's going on in DC. You could talk about really any issue. I mean, military was the reason why we did convene, but there was lots of other conversations that occurred. Outside of that, you've got local offices. We have have had and continue to have good communication with the local offices for both of our senators. And then we've got a new representative now, but formerly had good communication with their offices as well. One of the things that I talk about, kind of environmental issues that I dealt with actually when I was North Pole City Mayor, was the sulflane contamination in the area. So the North Pole had 2 refineries. One of them had a pretty substantial leak of one of their lagoons, which was carrying a substance called sulflane. And just kind of chemically, what it's used for is to pull the water out of the crude oil as it comes down through the pipeline. And so it's very water soluble, and so it can stick with the water, and then they can filter the water out of the oil, and then they can process it that way. Unfortunately, it made its way into the groundwater, and because it is so soluble, it made a plume that was several miles in size. I was on the council at the time when this was coming to a head, and then was mayor during that time, where we had litigation lawsuits with the state, with the refinery, and the former refinery owner, and spent a lot of time on, okay, what does a community do when you've got groundwater that, at the time, they said, we don't really know if it's not healthy to drink, but you probably shouldn't drink it. And so there was a lot of different things that were happening at the time. They were putting filtration systems in, they were putting water tanks in, and I took a stand and said, this is something I think it was like 3 miles by 2 miles in size, and it was growing, it was getting bigger and bigger. This is something that our community is going to deal with for decades. And said, really the solution is these areas need to be provided with piped water, so folks can guarantee that they've got clean drinking water. And so that was something the city council agreed with. We pursued that, and ultimately had a settlement that included $100 million that was used to expand the water system for that area. And that was a huge success. I mean, at the time, and I think still, there's not really a great way to clean up that size of a plume. But we were able to guarantee that residents had safe drinking water and had a water system that was connected to them. You had asked about like other opportunities for local folks to engage. One of the things that we did jump into the last couple of years when I was mayor is the Arctic Mayors Forum, as well as the Arctic Assembly, Arctic Circle Assembly. And that was a really eye-opening experience for me. I tend to be a bit of I'm born and raised here in Fairbanks. I go out, but I always come back, and I'm not really one to go out into these fancy places. And it was actually one of my staff members, Miss Brittany Smart, who said, really this is, as an Arctic community, there was no other Arctic community participation in the state at the time. And she said, Bryce, we've got to do this. We have got to be at the convening here. And so we went to Reykjavik, and it opened my eyes to what issues other Arctic communities are dealing with. You get in a room with people from all across the Pan-Arctic, and it's the same issues, whether it be subsistence rights issues, whether it be land issues, whether it be water issues, whether it be housing issues, energy issues. They were the same exact things. It didn't matter what your country of origin was. And so that was really powerful for me to be able to get out and engage with leaders from across the world to talk about these issues and then build those relationships. And that's something that, as we did transition with Mayor Hopkins, said, hey, really, this is something you've got to be involved in because it will open your eyes to these issues. And then it opens connections too. And so since that time, Alaska's got a very good presence, I would say, with the Arctic Mayors Forum. We've got, I think Utqiagvik is involved. I think Anchorage is involved now. And of course, Fairbanks is involved. So those type of experiences, it may seem a little bit, for me, I'm like, gosh, mayors traveling to Reykjavik, that sounds pretty dang awesome. It is, but it's also very important. And I would encourage, our local leaders to be engaged at that kind of global level.
Great, thank you. I wanted to inquire further on that $100 million legal settlement regarding the size of the plume. So though the area could not be remediated due to the size and the unique qualities of the sulfane, I appreciate your aspect that, the time factor, that communities will continue to deal with that long after anyone is in office. But so will the animal population. So although it was some time ago during your time at North Pole, early on in your career, as you discussed, do you recall about with that settlement? I'm sure the lawyers thought of it, with so much they have to handle, but were any engineers consulted? Were any chemists consulted? How would that sulfane interact with the environment? If it's water soluble, what about, oh my gosh, I actually have an opportunity to use a niche scientific word, but it's so abstruse, I never get to use it. Well, anyway, with, the flow of water, hydrometeorology, with, although it doesn't rain nearly as much here as where I'm from. You practically live in a fish tank, which I like. Not everybody likes to feel like they're sweating constantly. But how would that affect the water systems? How would that affect the lakes and the rivers? And was that accounted for in the settlement? Were environmental engineers and water engineers were they hired to go out there and, not just take care of the people, but the environment where, there are so many different interacting factors for One Health. I'm curious about what similar actions were taken for the longevity of that living space.
Yeah, so there was lots of experts involved, chemists, hydrologists, lots of studying and testing done on lakes and water bodies. What they found with sulfolane is if it's trapped in the ground, it doesn't break down or dissipate, or it does very, very, very slowly. Once it's exposed to a water body, so like a lake, the natural, whether it be the light, the chemistry basically makes it to where it's non-detectable. So that was a good thing. They were doing some experiments with like air sparging, where can they take air and inject it into the ground to help break this chemical down. Fortunately, I would say it was not as big of an issue for like open water bodies. It was mainly when it was trapped in the ground. What kind of developed during that timeline was the PFOS/PFOA contamination, which North Pole also deals with within the same plume. It's not the same size or extent, but we're seeing across the nation, and that has lots of there's lots of harmful impacts to that that we're seeing with the ecology. I mean, fish, you can't eat that fish. It impacts the entire habitat. It does not dissipate when it gets into a water body. So sulfolane, I would say yes. That was taken into consideration, but there's other things that kind of have emerged, and there's still ongoing litigation and whatnot on those issues as we speak.
So I just want to give you another round of applause for. And you just hit all these keywords in the readings. It's like you read the leadership books ahead of time. And we do have also former Mayor Luke Hopkins who arrived. Would you mind sharing space with him for a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you come up and please come on up, and I'll read a short introduction. And this was just a bit of a surprise, but leaders are adaptable, as I'm sure both of you are. So let me just remind folks who may not know who this is. Luke Hopkins, right, served as the Fairbanks North Star Borough Mayor from 2009 to 2015, right? Well, you can maybe talk about your beginning of your public service journey, right, on the Planning Commission back in the last century, as we like to say, 1997, and then later serving on the Borough Assembly. So now that I have you both here, I think of it very comparatively. Each of you, right, took these steps towards public service that resulted in being mayor, that shaped your pathways, right? Which is wonderful. And you were, right, I remember now, one of the keystone components, you talked about the military, was you're working with Alaskan Air Force Base and working to ensure that was developed. So let's just put our hands together, not to take too much time from you, and welcome our other mayor. And yeah, you've been listening. So what are some of the thoughts you'd like to impart?
Well, if anybody's running for public office, don't act like I did and come late when Mayor Ward carried everything here. So, but.
You won't have to stand or sit. Yeah,
Oh,
however.
Hey, you shouldn't go. So yes, I have many years in serving the public and in appointed and elected office. So started with the Planning Commission, where I was elected to that. But prior to that, I was appointed to work on borough issues in a different capacity, so I didn't have to run for office there. But this is all about mayors, and one of the interesting things is that things that get dumped on the mayor that have to get resolved through bringing issues mostly to the public body, the assembly, but also the mayor's office, the mayor, him or herself, has a great deal of ability to tweak things by jumping into the issues, whether it's local, state, or federal, or worldwide, as Mayor Ward did. And I think that's, in terms of what was enjoyable, was the effect that one elected person can have on a community to hopefully do constructive work. And I think that every single mayor that has been here in the Fairbanks North Star Borough has done specifically that. I'd be glad to answer questions. If anybody wants to throw those things at me, but
Well, maybe
but a couple
I'll
of-
just pose a question.
Sure.
Because of the timing and that way, but it helps with the students also to compare you both a little.
Mhm.
And so when you think about your own leadership style, Mayor Ward talked a bit about how he felt about his own leadership style. How do you characterize yourself when you think of the leadership style you used? Maybe not even only as mayor, but right throughout your public service. How do you think of it?
I guess I see myself as, hopefully, and others see it, as wanting to get information, sometimes overloading myself with all the various aspects of an issue with various points of view, but then you have to come to grips with what position are you going to take and how are you going to solve if it's a problem? How are you going to bring something new into the community? And for example, I guess in some aspects of my journey here in the Fairbanks North Star Borough, I was considered in the liberal aspect. But when you start talking about military and supporting military and actually trying to grow the military here in the interior of Alaska, that changes people's view of you, but I still kept going with it. So, and I think I came out the other end with the same, I guess, liberal attitude that I had when I went into it. But that was a very interesting situation because a lot of individuals that were quite concerned about what I was trying to do with the military in the state. In a negative view of my positions. So I think it's listening and looking at what's best in the bigger picture and how to get that implemented for our community is what my style would be. However, that's choppy and irreverent. That's how it went. But again, maybe that answered your question and maybe other people want to get more clarification, but having also the air quality issue that was really dumped on probably mostly during my administration with the federal government coming in and the EPA coming in and saying you can't continue this way and you have to put in rules and regulations and we're going to make sure that they're enforced for wood burning. And of course, that went round and round and it ended up hopefully in the state's lap and the state EPA was relegated to bringing those things forward. But the wood stove changeout program, forcing people to get rid of their stoves that were polluting by, when I say forcing, that's kind of a fuzzy word for it, but because many people did not comply with that. But anyway, questions before we have to stop? I see one hand. There are two hands.
Larry Hinsman, I'm curious, like you were a real strong leader for the borough developing a climate change adaptation strategy. And I'm curious, can you look back and reflect on that as far as how that went, what came out of it and where we stand now, and with respect to support and opposition from the state and from the federal government?
Okay, that to me is a complicated position because I probably, when I went into office, there was pretty strong contingent that put me there that wanted a action plan brought forward. And I guess I fell over to other issues in the borough scheme of things, specifically with the possible closing of Eielson Air Force Base, and what that meant, what that would mean to the community. So I think that it didn't come to the fruition that I had hoped to do, but when you're mayor, you've got so much effort and so much time that the assembly then took lots of that on with coming forward with an action plan for that issue, and it's still being pushed back and forth now. So I don't think it's been resolved. There's various aspects, very strong community groups, but yeah, there's a plan, but then gets modified depending on the intent of the assembly when actions are brought forward. So I think it's a continual process that we're seeing and have seen through various groups and elected leaders and how they approach it, whether they support it and how heartily they support it or oppose it. So I don't have a clear answer on it right now because there's an action plan, but there's not much going on with that action plan through our borough legislative actions. And current or recent mayor probably has a different opinion of it because he's been with it also. It's a very interesting situation, I find, that we're still in that same aspect of we have a plan. How do you implement it? What's being done for it? What powers do you have? That's how I see it.
Thank you. We have a question for both of you from online.
Come on up.
Danielle would like to ask both of you. She said, I'm concerned about equity with access to internet in every area, housing and sustainability. How has the plume affected your thinking about new industries entering the Arctic business space?
The plume of air quality? I mean, that's how I see that word, but I don't know whether there's any further.
Do they mean, I'm not
But-
sure I understood the question either, Sarah. Could you reread it maybe? And then I'll just prompt you that the last question, it would be nice for you to answer. We asked Mayor Ward as well, would be what advice you have for people who want to be leaders. So if you want to think about that for a moment and we get some clarification from Sarah. What do you think? Okay, they're typing. Thank you all for your patience.
While that's being typed, we have another one. How do you approach maintaining professionalism and productivity when working with older individuals in senior positions who may be resistant to change or challenging to collaborate with?
Well, I guess an example I would give first is one of the last things that I had to or wanted to juggle, and I think we did juggle it, was bringing the approval of marijuana use, public marijuana use, into our Fairbanks North Star Borough with the sale of marijuana, and brought together a very diverse group that had a series of many tables and many chairs and many opinions of what we ought to be doing. And I think that having discussions and trying to get people to accept various opinions and come out with a solution that's not unanimous, but yet just like on the Borough Assembly many times, it's a vote of not a unanimous vote. And so we had on that issue with for the sale of marijuana within the borough, it's looking back on it makes me smile with all the different opinions we had from medical and religious and conservative and liberal individuals. So just work through that. And then the assembly was the final one that passed that ordinance for how to have marijuana sales within the borough. Don't know whether that answers the question, but that was one that was quite the process.
But I think it points to that you're not always going to have a unanimous set of advisors or a public, and yet we still have to make these decisions sometimes. I think you both reflected that often we can't wait for unanimity. We just move forward as needed. Did we get clarification, Sarah?
Yes, we do. So Bryce, this question is for you.
Oh.
It's from Danielle. And she says, thank you for your honesty about the leak. After hearing you today, I'd vote for you for senator or Congress. Servant leadership is a style I admire so greatly. Having a growth versus fixed mindset is something educators are encouraging students to have across the nation. I'm concerned about equity with access to internet in every area, housing, and sustainability. How has the plume affected your thinking about new industries entering the Arctic business space? And that's in regard to the PFAS leak that cannot be remediated.
Yeah, I would say it's certainly, as we talk about development in areas, right? You look at these things like, PFAS or whether it be sulfate or these other issues that we are dealing with. Back in the day it was dry cleaners, right? That was the big thing that was impacting groundwater. And I think Alaska, by and large, has set a very high standard when we talk about development of industry, specifically to like oil industry. But I think as we talk about, all of these different impacts, we look at, look at how much this has impacted our community, whether like with PFAS in particular. You've got the airport here, International Airport, that's got groundwater contamination. You've got both of the bases that have groundwater contamination. You've got North Pole. Before long, you're not gonna be able to drink any of the water. And so as you do talk about these new industries coming in, I think we have to be mindful for the impact of the future. And we don't have a crystal ball, right? We don't know what particular issue is gonna be the issue that we're gonna deal with tomorrow, but are we taking the time to prepare for and make sure that when these industries do come in, that there's the safeguards to say, hey, we know that there's this thing that you're using. How do we make sure it doesn't get into the environment, whether it be through the air or whether it be through the water? And so, I think we definitely need to have that and continue to have that high standard as Alaska, and take maybe what we've done with oil and look at how we can expand that for other areas. I think we know that we are going to have development that occurs in our communities. I think the key is how do we do it in a way that is sustainable for the future? And I don't have a perfect answer for that, but I'm willing to keep learning and keep exploring on how we can.
You could probably say the same thing about air quality. The air quality issue, if we're not meeting those standards with industry, whether it's the extractive industries or the oil and mining, et cetera, or just the regular commercial aspects of a compact community and the air quality situation. But that's also something that we have to be mindful of, and we have to put in changes if we're not meeting the standards for health reasons, and also for the aspects of getting federal and state funding here that supports many of our operations.
I think one of the examples that we dealt with here locally and that we've kind of grappled with, don't necessarily have a perfect answer for, is talk about our waste streams. We've talked about the sustainability plan, and the Borough Assembly did pass a version of one this last fall, or last summer, fall, somewhere in that time frame. But looking at things like electronics, there's a lot of metals, there's a lot of things that are in your electronics. Do we want to be putting those in our landfill? Fortunately, our landfill is now lined, but the old one wasn't. These are type of things I think kind of in line with this question, that as a community, are we looking at these and saying, okay, what are we doing today that won't leave a legacy issue for tomorrow. And you know, I think there's still room for growth. There's still room for us as a community to continue to say, here's some stuff that we're going to do. I bring up electronics because it is something that the borough is working on to say, oh, let's recycle our electronics, right? Instead of putting them in the landfill, but it's expensive. You know, it's $150 a ton roughly to bring waste to the landfill. It's about $1,000 a ton. I think it's actually more than that now to recycle a ton of electronics. But are you going to pay for it today or are you going to pay for it tomorrow? It might be cheaper still at $1,000 a day to recycle those electronics than to put them in the landfill and then have to deal with it 100, 200, 300 years from now. So.
Okay, for interest of time and the students in the class, Mayor Hopkins, would you take us home with some advice to young or new leaders? I've had to very much change. We don't have young students or anything because we serve everyone. So to people who would like to become leaders, to new leaders, what would you say? Do you have any parting words?
Well, I guess I would use the example of my own family. And so my adult son is now borough mayor. And the enthusiasm that I see in him and the ideas that he has for things he wants to see the borough move towards, that's what I would say the youth, the people that are way younger than I am that are coming along, that's the spirit, that's the attitude to have, as opposed to shutting things down and saying no, no, no. I think Mayor Ward was one that was an example of it, of moving past that aspect of it and being creative in solutions that bring quality of life to the borough. And I think that that's something that those much more youthful than I am have that attitude and should have that attitude, because they're going to be those individuals will be in charge of what happens in the community and the ability to change what happens in the community. So.
Absolutely, right? So
I look
thank
at
you
it.
both again, and I'm so pleased to have you both together here.
Could I give one shameless plug? So
Moment.
if you want to learn more about your local mayors, we actually did a series called Leading the Borough, and we interviewed former mayors, including Mayor Hopkins, as well as family members for some of our local leaders that are no longer with us. So if you're interested, go to the borough webpage.
Okay.
You can check out the mayor's office, and it's the Leading the Borough series. They're about 10 minutes long, and we've got a section for every one of our mayors.